Hello and welcome to the E5 podcast. In this, for God's sake, hang on.
And deep breath. Feel the love, darling. Feel the love. Raise the energy. Play with your crystals, darling. Come on.
Right, 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the E5 podcast. I'm joined here today by Paul Meenan, and we're going to be talking about electricians working on fire alarm systems. We're going to be talking about all sorts of controversial topics, who does what and who goes where. So how you doing, Paul?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. These podcasts are an interesting way of communicating, having chats. It's really weird, really, because we kind of have these chats all the time, but now we're recording them. So it's like, oh, okay. It's a bit of a learning curve, I suppose, for us all, but a good one, I suppose. But yes, this is an interesting topic. There's a lot of debate in the industry about it.
It's something that I really enjoy talking about because as much as I'm an electrician, I say I'm a fire alarm engineer as well. My background is, I've done an electrical apprenticeship and I got into fire alarms how a lot of people got into fire alarms, where I was kind of pushed by the company I was working for. They got some contracts in, they got some jobs, and they said, "You're an electrician, you can wire some cable, go and do that." And I actually worked for a company that had two divisions, an alarm side and an electrical side. And in a way, the fire alarm stuff kind of crossed over. So it worked quite well. And I just really sort of enjoyed it, and it got bigger and bigger.
Well, I'm not afraid to say that I am non-competent as far as fire alarm engineering goes. The last time I touched a fire alarm panel, I was working on the tools at London Underground, and we were working on Kentech equipment. We were putting in pyros, which not many people do anymore. And yes, we were wiring control interfaces for external IOs and all that sort of stuff. But it's been so many years, and the technology is moving on. For me now, I actually specify, I've put in a couple of wireless ones, and I'm looking at renewing quite a lot of fire alarms at the moment on the railway that I work on. But I've more moved away from fire alarms into the fire engineering side of it. So fire is quite a unique discipline because a lot of electricians will train and upskill to develop their competence in fire alarms. But what I did was I went away and I did a NEBOSH Fire, which anybody who wants to do a great safety course, the NEBOSH Fire certificate is fantastic, which then immediately takes you into the realm of fire safety, which applies to existing buildings. But fire engineering is that theoretical approach if you were developing and designing new infrastructure, and creates a lot of rules and principles that you must follow when complying with Building Regulation Part B or BS 999. However, today we're just talking about 5839 sparks and alarms.
So, Paul, there's one little topic that keeps coming up. People always come to me and say whose responsibility it is, and it's where mains meets the fire alarm panel and equipment.
Yep, which you wouldn't work without it. So it's not a new thing, is it really? It's just fire alarms have run off mains for many, many years, but it's that interpretation and it's the line of demarcation between mains and fire alarm, isn't it, really? That seems to really lit a fire, especially on LinkedIn. There's been quite a lot of healthy debates recently about that.
It is, and it's something that I can fully understand why there's a lot of debate about, because when BS 5839 Part 1 2017 changed, it had a little amendment on one of the regulations, 25.2, about the isolators, or the supplies to the fire alarm panel. So what it says now, and it actually refers to the electricity at work regulations. So they used to have to be double pole. They don't need to be anymore. But if I just read out the regulation, it says, to facilitate local isolation during maintenance, suitable means should be provided for local isolation of the low voltage supply circuit that serves the power supply and control equipment. And then it says, there's a note, safe isolation is required under the terms of the Electricity at Work Regulations 1989. The previous version of this standard recommended double pole isolation. This is no longer specifically recommended as, under the Electricity at Work Regulations 1989, safe isolation requires verification that isolation has been successful.
Trouble is, that's never changed since 1989.
I
So
know.
I'm gonna openly say this to the people who wrote 5839. Well done, congratulations for developing and updating that standard. Well done for catching up with something that's been around since 1989. I don't see a massive issue with that, but yet there is a lot of debate, because to facilitate local isolation during maintenance, absolutely, you should always, on a fixed piece of plant, if you can have local maintenance, you should have. It's a lot more effective and safer for the guy doing the maintenance. The suitable means, again quoting 25.2 recommendation C, should be provided for local isolation that serves it. Now, I know everybody used to have a double pole isolator, but nowadays people worry about batteries and floating voltages, because obviously if you break the neutral and the line conductor, which would be the disconnection of all sources of energy, you've still got a source of energy within the panel. So even if you put a double pole isolator in, you're not actually isolating from all sources of electrical energy. Henceforth, I think, and Dan, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, that everybody seems to just go now with the fused spur, non-switch, just the fused spur now. That's what I'm seeing in a lot of places. I used to use the old rotary isolators locked in the on position, but that was on railways, IP65 ones. But now everybody's going for these just single pole unswitched fused spurs.
Yeah, more or less. There's different versions out there because they need to be read or labelled fire alarm and make it clear that it's the fire alarm panel. So
Right.
there's all sorts out there, and even there's a lot of accessories I've seen out there. Actually, they're not double pole, and they've been used for many years, even though in previous standards it should have been.
I don't see a massive issue of single or double pole. I mean, I know a lot of even manufacturers of circuit breakers are saying it's great that they've got double pole, which it really is. But you should only really use double pole if you're considering what's connected downstream. Because if you have, I mean, I've actually seen this, and this is genuinely a true story. I once saw a 30 kVA UPS be supplied from a 4-pole isolator switch, which meant when you isolated it, it was generating two 30-volt mains with no neutral connection, so the whole thing was floating.
Yeah.
And that was a designer had done that and not realised the recommendations of chapter 54 or 55, I think it was in the regs. I think it was 55, generators and other things. But just on that electricity at work regulations clause, if I tell you regulation 4, it's entitled Systems, Work Activities and Protective Equipment, and this is pretty much a statutory, with the exception of part 2. So there's 4 parts: 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'll just read them out. Part 1: all systems shall means mandatory, be constructed as to prevent, so far as reasonably practicable, danger. The next one: as may be necessary to prevent danger, all systems shall be maintained to prevent, so far as reasonably practicable, such danger. So if you can foresee it, do something about it, unless it's horrendously cost prohibitive. But on LV, you haven't got that defence. Every work activity, including operations, use and maintenance, so this is fire alarms, of a system and work near a system, shall be carried out in a manner so as not to give rise, so far as reasonably practicable, to danger. So if you had a non-qualified electrical operative working on or near low voltage live exposed terminals, then you could possibly be giving rise to danger. Part 4 of Regulation 4. Any equipment provided under these regulations for the purpose of protecting persons at work on or near electrical equipment shall be suitable for the use of which is provided, be maintained in a suitable for that use, and be properly used. So Regulation 4 really does make you think about what are you doing, how are you doing it, who is doing it, who is working on or near. Now, the 25.2 recommendation for power supplies, that is kind of inferring to Regulation 12 of the Electricity at Work regulations, which is called Means for Cutting Off the Supply and for Isolation. And it basically says, subject to paragraph 3, where necessary to prevent danger, suitable means Suitable means can be defined by the designer or the owner or the competent persons, I would assume, including where appropriate, method of identifying circuits shall be available for, and then it's A and B, cutting off the supply of electrical energy to any equipment, and B, the isolation of any electrical equipment. Now, one thing as well is worth just chucking in, isolation can be electrical and mechanical, and on fire alarms, there's obviously the isolation supply coming in, but then also that source of energy, batteries. Now, it says in note 2, in paragraph 1, isolation means, and this is something that electricians should be able to quote off the top of their head, the disconnection and separation of the electrical equipment from every source of electrical energy in such a way that this disconnection and separation is secure. If you use a single pole isolator or a non-switch fuse spur, you are technically not disconnecting that equipment from every source of electrical energy. So when it infers that, as recommended under electricity at work regulations, my professional engineering judgment is it's requiring you to realize that we know fire alarms have a battery system, that single pole will disconnect the line conductor, the neutral conductor will still allow a current flow, but safe working procedures will then require a competent person to go in and disconnect the battery supplies and then check at the points of connection that there is no electrical energy left, so they can issue a permit to work to people to work on or near that equipment. But that's where it all goes wrong.
This is where it goes wrong because a lot of fire alarm engineers, they don't have such training on safe isolation, so they would require somebody who does. So in some sense, in some cases, it might need more than one person. And the problem is, in the real world, that doesn't happen, Paul. As we know, if someone's changing over a panel or working on a panel, we know that alarm engineers do often work on low voltage systems.
So do you think there's a complacency, or is it the fact that the modules of the fire alarm courses may, I'll use a Dave term, they give a piecemeal effort in providing some knowledge on electrical isolation and expect the guy to be remembering it 6 months after he's done the course?
I don't remember any fire alarm training I've done, and I've done quite a lot.
You have, yeah.
I've done quite a lot that teaches you about, or really goes into about mains, low voltage. It's all obviously the actual fire alarm side. However, even the main supply to any fire alarm panel equipment or any part of the system does form part of the fire alarm. It forms part of it. It's the critical path, because obviously it's providing power to it. So it's a bit of a controversial topic, really, because where do you stand? And
so the only thing I can say is, I mean, there's a few things that you have to consider, and that is, okay, personal story, I suppose. I have had to throw fire alarm companies, contractors off stations for doing horrendous work, and I have questioned the competence of the fire alarm contractor and the individual installer, and it was said to me that they were qualified to an equivalent of a level 2. So what's that? That's like a part 1 or part 2, or an NVQ level 2 maybe. It's definitely not a part 2, but that's basic fundamental training there, really, isn't it? I mean, when you were employing fire alarm engineers, what level of electrical competency did you train them on? Or were they just guys trained to run red FP200s, clip them with P-clips, put them on little light duty tray, little bit of Meccano, and that was it?
So all of my guys that work for me, first and foremost, they were electricians, other than one. So every single one of them had done an apprenticeship or some method in who, is an electrician, and they were managed underneath, my management, and so, first and foremost, they were electricians. They understood the fundamental principles and had evidence. Now, the person who wasn't, he come in on a project as a pair of helping hands, to be honest, a labourer, helping with cabling, getting stuff in, obviously not energising anything. Now, he actually turned out to be pretty handy, Paul. So I offered him employment and put him on fire alarm training. But what we also did was I can't remember the name of the course now. It's 2 evenings a week for 2 years. So he could do his basic electrical training. Now, it was never to become an electrician, but it's to give him the idea and understanding behind mains. However, he was never going to be running in main circuits, low voltage circuits, testing them, but he would assist and understand it. But he was more for, he ended up being a service engineer, and a very, very good one at that.
Well, it's the old time served, isn't it? When you've got the pragmatic approach of the hands-on teaching on site combined with good mentoring, and also the formal equipment training. I mean, I know the very first electrician I ever worked with, a guy called Chris. I'll never forget him because he was brilliant and he had no qualifications whatsoever. But
Yeah.
he had time application. He could bend conduit, do trunking, size the trunking. He was dyslexic, bless him, and he couldn't do the exams. And he went to college. He learnt it all, but he could never pass them. But yeah, I couldn't judge him as not being an electrician, although I know the industry would. But he was brilliant, and he taught me absolutely loads. And it was just a shame that the industry sometimes doesn't, well, 20 odd years ago, it didn't cater for that. Now, obviously, it does cater for a lot more. But just going off on, I was talking about Regulation 12 of EAWR. It's probably worthwhile because there's probably people screaming at this podcast going, how dare he, how dare he, how dare he. Regulation 13 is precautions for work on equipment made dead. So once you've made the isolations, you have to take adequate precautions to prevent the equipment that's been made dead in order to prevent danger while work is carried out on or near. That term on or near again, and those precautions may involve lock-offs, written procedures, and you then take it further. And this is why I like the electricity work regs. It's a very logical stepped process. Regulation 14, work on or near live conductors. So if you've isolated, let's say you've opened a panel, but you've isolated the circuits outgoing the panel, but the mains into it is still live. Technically, under Regulation 14, you're working on or near live conductors. Regulation 14 clearly states no person shall be engaged in any work activity on or near any live conductor other than one suitably covered with insulating material so as to prevent danger, unless it's unreasonable in all circumstances. There's no excuse really to not switch off the mains power. And also, is it unreasonable in circumstances for him to be at work on or near when it's live? And then also suitable precautions, your GSA, your test probes, your rubber gauntlets, your rubber matting, your brown trousers, as I like to say. The fact of the matter is isolation and live working, there's a massive debate in our industry. I've always said the only time you work live, when people say you can't work live, yes, you can. You can work live, because when you do an earth loop impedance test, you're working live. When you're doing PFC, PSC, ZE testing, you're working live. You're working on or near live conductors. When you are doing isolation, proving the unit live, dead, etc., you're working on or near, but you have suitable and sufficient measures, controls. When you have a fire alarm panel and a spark has basically just said, I ain't got time to do it, just open up the panel and isolate all the outgoing circuits. I've seen that happen many a time, and I've walked up to fire alarm engineers and gone, do you realise that panel's live? Now, there's a lot of debate in the industry, as you rightly said, about who should be doing what. And I think, I don't know if you've ever heard this before. Have you heard of the 1 meter rule?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
So yeah, the 1 meter rule is it's kind of, everybody references it as Regulation 14 of the electricity at work regulations, but it's about the need for the conductor to be live, the need for uninsulated, and the need to take precautions to prevent injury. But one of the things I really like, because it's actually the most explained of all the regulations, which is quite scary in itself, but if you actually look right at the back of the electricity at work regulations in Appendix 3, it's called Workspace and Access, and it's a historical comment on old legislation, the 1908 Electricity Act, actually. And in that, Regulation 17, it actually quotes it as those constructed for low pressure have a clear height of 7 foot or 3 foot. And it gives some old-fashioned distances, which you should be staying away from. Now, a lot of people have actually transposed that into a meter rule. Now, that's actually referenced in BISRA engineering documents for
Yeah.
safe clearances and walkways and stuff like that. But there is no. I think it depends on the employer as to what the safe working distance is. I personally think a meter is good, but if you have someone who isn't fully qualified to evoke an electrical isolation, then you're going to need to have a company process that mandates
Yeah.
an electrician is going around doing the isolation so that people can work safely.
And that's, well, inside a lot of these panels, the way the low voltage comes in and is terminated usually has some form of barrier or enclosure within the panel.
Yeah.
However,
Effectively, you're
obviously,
double insulating it, aren't you, really? You're
yeah.
making it very difficult to access.
Well, having said that, that's the live terminals, but the actual, quite often the cables will just be single insulated cables coming in,
Yeah.
and that poses some form of risk, especially FP, because the insulation quite often,
It's quite soft.
yeah, it's very soft. It can be broken with a screwdriver quite easily, and it's just what I'm worried about is just fire alarm engineers going into these panels without awareness of the risk. You know?
For me, where there is a magnitude of fault current, I would, if I was running cables into a fire alarm panel, again, I haven't been in one in years, but it might be a good idea that if manufacturers are listening, that they have a non-conductive compartment where that goes around the panel where the mains power cable has to terminate and can be protected all the way through to a double insulated terminal where a tool is needed to open that terminal to get to the insulated conductors where the cables are connected. That would then allow people to work a lot safer if they had to work on or near. However, and people are screaming now, I know they're screaming, if it can be isolated, it will be isolated. But you and I both know, and I'm sure you've seen this, you go to a bank in London and you need to do some servicing on a fire alarm panel. And the first thing the facilities manager says to you is, we can't shut it off, mate. Can't
Yeah.
shut it off. So straight away, you're then sitting there judging, how do I not breach the legislation and the guidance in 5839? How would you approach that, Dan? What's your view on that?
My view is pretty simple: is that anybody working on the LV side or near it, as we've discussed, needs to be trained suitably to be able to work on it. Otherwise, they can't.
I agree. I think one of the first steps of mitigation is not just having a level 2 qualified fire alarm engineer. It's actually sending an electrician who is competent
Yeah,
to
and
work on fire alarm systems.
because it's quite simple. If we had a scenario here, let's say you send a fire alarm engineer who isn't electrically trained to work on low voltage systems to change a fire alarm panel. Now, bearing in mind, some might be very old, the way it's wired. You'll have mains cables come in the panel and out to an isolator and back again. So they go through the panel. So you can't not isolate it. You need some form of isolation. I see it all the time. Obviously, it's really poor practice, but you're up against it. So let's say someone who isn't competent to work on low voltage systems does something, knocks something, bashes an FP, and it shorts out a bit of metal or something. Sparks fly as it does. It trips out something maybe it shouldn't do, or whatever. There could be multiple reasons. Somebody might get hurt. We might have some sort of business operation impact by something tripping, because not all fire alarms meet standards where it should be a dedicated circuit and what have you. I mean, where do you stand then if you was being sued for either injury to somebody or loss of business or something like that? You need to be able to justify that you was doing things correctly. And if you're not electrically trained to work on low voltage systems, you've got no defence at all.
No, you don't. And the trouble is, and this is one thing that I think we're never not going to repeat, is the legislation that you will be prosecuted under the law. If you're standing in a court, there is no defence, because that legislation is free. The Electricity at Work
Yeah.
regulations is a free to download document. There is no excuse and there is no defence. However, excuse me, under Regulation 29, which is the one that I have told every single person I've ever worked with to memorise, it is called defence. So, Mr. Jackson, in any proceeding for an offence consisting of a contravention of regulations 4, safe system of work, 5, 8, earthing, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, so that covers all the isolation working on or near, and 16, competence. So if you contravene the regulation for competence, it shall be a defence for any person, you, the electrician, the fire alarm engineer, to prove they took all reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence to avoid the commissioning of that offence. So if you're a fire alarm engineer and you've turned around, you're listening to this and going, do you know what, actually, I think I need more training, then write to your boss and actually say to him, dear Mr. Jones, I've been working here for X amount, I'm fairly confident on the panels, etc. However, I wish to develop my knowledge under electricity at work regulations. I would like to attend some training, as I believe that my competence under regulation 16 needs to be developed further. My understanding of isolations needs to be developed further, and I believe that this will allow me not to contravene the defence clause. If you send that to your boss is going to be in the dock, not you, because you've taken all reasonable steps to tell him. And one of the defining merits of competence is the ability to understand your line of demarcation. I can't do that. It's the ability to say no. I'm quite happy to say I cannot work on or near a fire alarm system anymore because I'm not competent to. I used to be years ago. I'm not anymore, and the technology's moved. So my defence regulation, if my boss said to me, go and do that fire alarm, I'd turn around and say, I don't really know what to do, and I can't be held accountable for it, and it will probably break, and you'll end up costing a lot more money. And I'll put it in writing, and that's my defence. And then if anything happens to me, my boss will then be pulled into court and said, well, your guy told you he wasn't confident to work on it. What's your defence? He has none. And that's the thing, guys and girls, you can use this legislation to actually turn a corner, protect yourself, not cover your ass, that's a horrible term, but actually learn the legislation in the land that will keep you and your bosses out of prison. A good boss is the one who wants to stay out of prison. So yeah, defence, it's a very small regulation to learn, and the note is brilliant because it says Regulation 29 defence only applies in criminal proceedings. It provides a defence for a duty holder, which, Dan, you are a duty holder of a company, who can establish that they took all reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence to avoid committing an offence. So, as I always say, if there's no earthing, if you haven't took steps to avoid committing an offence, then it's your neck on the line. It's the same with competency. If you send an unqualified person to work on a fire alarm, you are committing an offence. And it's very reasonable and foreseeable to not commit that offence and exercise due diligence by training and developing your guys. So for me, EAWR, it's an open shut case. However, the reason why there may be people going, yeah, whatever, mate, whatever, is because there's not enough people who've died, been injured, or been to court.
That's the truth.
It's as simple as that. And I'm, as you know, I'm a former electrician, now chartered fellow of the IET. You're a fellow yourself. And I can tell you now, engineering judgment on this is very much open shut, with the horrors of Grenfell on the eyes of the world on fire safety now. I am sure that there are a lot of electrical and fire alarm contractors out there who are skating on very thin ice.
Yeah. Well, this is the other. I mean, what we've just discussed is actually not really a problem for electricians. It's more fire alarm engineers, because it's something that they should be aware of. But other problems that electricians face, I get so many people come to me, Paul, who ask me really basic questions about detection, where it should go, and what have you. And they're working on fire alarm systems, but they don't own the standards. They don't own BS 5839 Part 1. They don't own the document.
It costs a fortune.
And it does. I mean, there are ways to get it. There are packages, parts of, trade bodies, if you're a member, or accredited, you can get them discounted. But to work on fire alarms, it is an extension, in my opinion, of basic electrical systems, and it's something that needs investment to understand, to become competent at.
It's probably worthwhile noting at this point, if you're an ECA member, they actually give you a limited subscription to BSI Online. I'm not, but I know they do it. It's also worth noting that NAPIT also give you a subscription to a number of standards. Now, I'm a NAPIT corporate member at work. I can't remember if 5839 is actually
Is there a
that.
fee? Is there a fee for that
Yeah,
subscription?
there is. It's
Yeah,
actually not that bad. The NAPIT one was 100 quid.
because I used to be BAFE accredited
Yeah.
under the SSAOB, who used to carry out audits, and they had the same scheme. It was £100 a year, and you got various fire safety documents, and it was an absolute no-brainer to pay that £100.
Well, I was kind of lucky as well, because when I worked for TfL, we had the mother of subscriptions to BSI Online. And I mean, literally
I bet.
every single thing imaginable you could get a copy of under the TfL license. It must have cost them millions for this
Wow.
subscription, because it didn't matter if it was bridges, civil engineering, electrical, mechanical, anything. It was great. It was a luxury, to be honest with you, to be able to get access like that. But I absolutely do not agree with the way that British standards, and I know everyone who works for BSI who sits in these committees will hate me for saying this, because there's some great people who do a lot of voluntary work. The BSI is operated under a royal charter. They make an absolute fortune. And yet, if I set up, right, let's say me and you tomorrow, Dan, which I know won't happen, but if me and you set up Paul and Dan Electrical and Fire Limited tomorrow, the amount of standards and guidance we would have to buy to do that, you're looking at about 100 standards,
Yeah.
ranging from 100 to £300 to £400.
Yeah.
So we're laying out thousands of pounds before we've turned a screwdriver. Never mind buying a van, uniforms, setup costs, office rental, fuel, time, your cash flow will be negative for age. If you're bankrupting yourself before you start. And then the worst thing is, you can go out and buy all these, and every 6 months they're being updated
Yeah. No.
on a rotation.
And we know there's loads of Facebook groups and social media groups that pass around these documents.
I know they're idiots.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, they're
They should
just so stupid.
send them to strangers, But you can see why
Yeah.
they do it. You can see why they do it.
Do you know what? I can see why they do it. I don't do it. I don't agree with it because it's illegal. But I absolutely, totally see why people do it. Because these standards were written years ago, and if all the people working on these committees are volunteers, where is the money going? And for me, I'm just going to go on a little BSI ramble here. The BSI, the day after Brexit was voted for, they then made a statement that said, we will continue harmonising with the EU. So they evidently didn't get the memo from 17 plus million people that said we want out of the EU. And now they're still going to be harmonising all the British standards with all of the committees around Europe, regardless of whether, because obviously we're going through Brexit at this moment in time, whether there's a hard Brexit or a deal Brexit. So that just tells you straight away that they don't even listen to government. But because they operate under royal assent, they're not governed or regulated. They make a fortune. And I genuinely don't know what they do to give back to those industries. I don't know what the BSI guys do for electrical, although I know the IET print it under license, so the IET technically for the Rhine regs, but 5839, 5266 and all the other standards, and you and I both know there's loads because we know Mr. Skirm and he's like a walking encyclopedia of them, as is David Watts. Where does the money go?
God knows. It'd be nice to go in my pocket.
Do you know what I mean? But it wouldn't be great if it went back into the trades, developing and upskilling the competency so we didn't have the accident statistics, to changing the hearts and minds for a better outlook, to being fairer, to having more support systems in place. Oh yeah, do you know what? I know I'm overwhelming this conversation, but it is a bugbear of mine. Sorry, mate.
That's all good. It's all good. And the other thing I find with electricians working on fire alarms, they always come to me and they say, what training course shall I do? What's best? And there are a variety of courses out there. Um, the FIA, you've got Search do some modules similar to what the FIA used to do. And then there's other organisations that might do, a 3-day course that will cover emergency lighting and fire alarms. And they always ask me, now, don't get me wrong, I've only ever done the FIA courses.
Yep.
So my experience with them has always been pretty good. However, they have changed them. So they used to be modules, and now it's a much broader spectrum of what you're supposed to be doing. Which
Please
is,
don't tell me it's a multiple choice exam.
I think they all are. I think so.
Oh, for God's sake.
That they literally all are. But it is no matter what course you do, they are short.
Wouldn't it be good though if you were to qualify as a fire engineer, that like with the old 2400 or 2394, I think it is now, the design course, that you had to design a fire alarm system from scratch in a
Yeah,
complex building that was given to you, or you had to do 3 designs in 3 environments. So one would be a domestic 5839 part 6, one would be a complex, one would be a non-complex design, which you had to do, and they were from a random pool, so everybody had different ones, so they couldn't copy and paste, to really demonstrate competence. Because I did years ago, I did a 5266 emergency lighting course. It was 3 days. Wow, what a game changer! It
yeah.
totally opened my eyes to.
I
I
done.
didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't know that you had to do an emergency line risk assessment. I didn't know about this. Put it at points of emphasis and change
yeah.
its direction. Put an emergency light out a fire alarm panel because it's a point of emphasis. In the corners of rooms, and we always said, why in the
Photometric
corners?
data and
Yeah,
how.
yeah,
Yeah,
all of that stuff that nobody's ever really seen is in these standards. And then I learned some basic rules, and then you go out and nearly 20 years after that course, you realise that emergency lighting, just because it's one of my little pet things that I talk about and stuff, it's just like this forgotten bastard in the industry.
the emergency lighting definitely is. People just use like a rule of thumb, but even when we stayed in one of the budget hotels, didn't we, near Alex recently?
Oh yeah, we did.
And I was looking at the emergency lighting and the fire safety precautions there, and the emergency lighting could really simply comply if the light fitting was moved 500 mil from where it was in the right direction. Happy days. However, it's not, and it's completely non-compliant, and it's just pure lack of education. It's just gone, oh, this is rule of thumb, this is what we do. And using emergency lights, and oh, we've got to have signs now, so we have these emergency lights here, so what we're going to do is whack some stickers over them so they're no longer emergency lights, you know.
Yeah, I know. And then you've also got the glow in the dark. What do they call it again? Is it
Photoluminescence.
photoluminescent signage, which people still use, but yet the ICEL committee, International Committee for Emergency Lighting, they published a memo, a guidance note years ago saying that they weren't fit for purpose, but yet they don't get pulled on fire risk assessments. I think what it is, and I've said this before, but I'll say it on here, I think the breaking up of the disciplines, the fragmenting and creating of silos, fire engineer, emergency lighting engineer, lighting designer, who does what. Because when I occasionally I do talks on emergency lighting, and I always put a picture up and I ask people, what's the issue? And then everybody looks blank. And then I put a flame, like a simulated fire. And then they go, oh, right, yeah, we get it. Yeah, where's the way out? And then I go, okay, but more importantly, who takes the lead on it? The fire engineer, the fire risk assessor, the
Yeah.
lighting designer, or the emergency lighting engineer?
Well,
Very difficult.
well, this is the thing with electricians need to really understand is that they need to read the regulatory reform order, understand it,
Indeed.
and work from it. Again, Paul, a lot of electricians come to me and I tell them this. It's a free document. You can go online. It's free. Read it. It's not a very big document, but
Mm.
it just states out the legislation behind what you've got to do. And it all comes down to risk assessment, fire risk assessment.
It does, and fire engineering is quite a common sense methodical approach if you look at. So you're
Yeah.
right. The regulatory reform order in brackets fire safety of 2005 caused chaos, because that integrated about 200 to 300 pieces of fire legislation into one document and converted it from everywhere must have a fire certificate to, when I say everywhere, not everywhere, but places of public gathering, cinemas, railway stations, to it's your risk. You own the risk, you manage the risk, you do your risk assessments. Now, there is not enough risk assessors in this country. Grenfell has evidently shown us there are massive flaws in fire engineering, fire products, fire safety, fire risk assessments, and the competence of all the above.
Yeah.
And the fire reform order is a basic guide. However, it's worth noting on this, there is a set of guidance notes. I don't know if you're aware, Dan, on the government website.
Yeah,
So
I do.
there's,
Yeah.
and it's like
Yeah.
places of congregation, like churches and stuff. And they're like 200 pages of really informative knowledge. Because if you actually look at some of the standards that you would expect to see loads about emergency lighting, it's barely mentioned.
Yeah, I
So
know.
if you're working in fire alarms, you should understand what the regulatory reform order is. You should have an awareness that Part B of the building regulations deals with fire safety. Obviously, Part P if you're in domestic, but that's 5839 Part 6. And also BS 9999, which is a great document, and that covers quite a lot of fire engineering safety principles. And if you can look at a logical narrative and some rules and principles in there, you can tie together a justification as to why you've done what you've done, because everywhere is slightly different. If you
Yeah.
use common rules of thumb, you can make mistakes. Points of emphasis are common rules of thumb. Now, they're generally accepted everywhere, but since 5266 has been rewritten, it's getting more complex because people are saying, well, on the railway, if my power fails or there's a fire, I have to keep the power going. I have to have the lighting going. Why? Because my control centres, are fireproof, fire rated, but there might be something outside and there needs to be a fire protected route of escape while we keep the place operational. And do you know what I mean? So it's really are a lot of places where if there is a worst case scenario, stuff still needs to work.
Yeah.
So not every place is the same anymore, and I think there's a lot of legacy equipment out there that's just not being maintained. Dare I say it? Every time I go into a high-rise building, I always stop at the entrance and look at the repeater panel, and just think, how many amber lights do I see? Do I see any red? And
Yeah.
virtually every time, mate, something's in silence because there's a fault somewhere.
Yeah.
You have to wonder why, though. On fire alarm, is it just that the FP200 breaks down? Because I've wired loads of fire alarms on pyro, and take you 25 years before you got a fault on any of it.
I've got to say, I mean, technology is becoming more and more prevalent within, life safety systems. And I do find, as time's gone on, you are more likely to have faulty equipment, or firearm panels are more sensitive to what is on the end of it. Now, some stuff might not mean that it doesn't conform, it's not working. However, again, I think management of fire alarm systems and fire safety in general is quite poor. The attitude towards it is quite poor.
Well, I think with fire safety, one of the things I've been campaigning for quite some time is a lot of people many years ago would argue you don't need fire alarms anymore because it's all risk based. Well, if that's the case, believe it or not, in the regulatory reform order fire safety, there is also a defence clause, and it is literally almost word for word the same as the electricity at work regulation.
Yeah.
And in the regulatory reform order, it mentions having the terms like suitable and sufficient, controls, measures, compartmentation, detection, possible suppression. So, if you're going into a building as a fire alarm engineer, you see holes in the walls, your duty of care is to report that, because that could be breaching a fire compartment. Fire systems are designed to protect and minimize damage, and more importantly, the first rule is to protect people.
Yeah.
And aid safe early evacuation before, that's what it's about. And I think fire systems over the years, if they're not maintained, well, it'll cost you more in the long run, won't it, really?
It does. But also I think what would massively help a lot of people working, whether you're managing fire safety systems or working on fire safety systems, is actually learning about fire behaviours. So
Okay.
because once you understand how fire works a little bit more, it really does. It's like you learn the dangers of electricity, but you need to know the dangers of fire. And I know we all know it, but how it operates in a certain way. But then it's like it makes you understand why you put a detector where you put it. If you speak to the manufacturers, also, you go down to their plants or wherever they are, their warehouses.
Hmm.
They can show you tests, they can show you stuff. It really helps you understand it more, and it helps you install, design, maintain in a more suitable manner, because you understand fire and its behaviours and how and the effects of what can happen.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a story now. I worked on a brand new build railway station that will not be named. And I went into it. It was a construction site, and the first question asked was, "Well, where's was the fire detection system?" I went onto a railway station, and there was no fire alarm panel. So naturally, I asked the question, and I was told, "No, no, don't worry about it. There's nowhere where a fire can develop undetected." Well, yes, there was. There were plant rooms that were, enclosed, and there was no, how are you going to put a human being in there watching constantly? Of course there was. So it turned out that when I actually did some research, that the company policy for the people building it was, if we put our staff in there, there must be fire alarms. But if the operator staff are in there, well, that's down to them. And
Right.
it was a really interesting debate, because I was having some massive debates with the builders at the time and the designers, and they were like, "Well, if you want fire alarm, fine, it's no problem, but you're putting it in at your cost." And we were like, "Hang on a minute, you're building a station for us to use, and yet you're telling us it's down to us to put the fire alarms in," which, is generally annoys you when they're already building it. So
Well,
what we
it begs to the question: what about their insurance?
Well, it also begs the question that their own standards, their own fire manual said that if you put our staff in there, that we will have to have fire detection systems in. So it was one rule for one rule for another.
Mm.
So I thought, I need to understand fire more. So I went and actually, while I was on this job, I developed and upskilled myself by doing the NEBOSH certificate. And I was so obsessed with getting the answers that I actually got a distinction. First ever course I ever got a distinction in. And I learnt loads, and I used the course to sound off my knowledge with the competent persons teaching it. And lo and behold, I wasn't wrong. I did my engineering research. I looked at railway standards, international standards, British standards, and it turned out that the root cause of it was the fire engineer did a risk assessment based on drawings, architectural drawings,
Right.
not construction drawings. And he also done a risk assessment on the drawing. Now, fire risk assessments are only ever done on existing buildings.
Yeah.
If you're designing something, you employ a fire engineer to apply BS 999 or Part B. You choose
Yeah.
which one you apply, and apply fire engineering principles, which would mean you must escape, you've certain distance to escape routes in certain times and all that. So they'll apply all those principles and define compartmentation, and whether there's a need for detection in public areas or non-public areas. They hadn't done it. They value engineered the fire safety out. So it basically turned out that they'd done a fire risk assessment. They value engineered the job. The risk assessment was basically to silence us. And unfortunately, it came to my desk and I refused it, which then caused a bit of conflict. And luckily, we presented our case in an objective and logical manner, as any engineer should, rather than ranting and raving. And the builders acknowledged it, and to save face, they gave us a pot of money and said, "Can you please install the fire alarms?" So we did,
Yeah.
which was good, but it should never have got to that. And that's the
Absolutely.
scary thing. That's the thing that really is quite frustrating. It should never ever get to those levels, but sometimes it does. And this is why the construction industry is very fickle, because people value engineer, or they cut corners. They may not know they're cutting corners, and it all costs and it all impacts people. And sadly, building services is the last in the door. It suffers from descopes the most. Fire safety generally is untouched, hopefully, on the alarms and stuff. But when you get down to emergency lighting, it's the scraps, isn't it, really? So These things can happen, but just remember the legislation is there to protect you and keep you out of prison. And as a minimum, cover your backside, put it in writing.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to make sure that fire safety is coordinated correctly in any project, whether it's small or large. And that again has its challenges
It's the
because
first thing, mate.
I
It's the
know,
first thing you should be. I've always said on rail, there are two areas of building services that must be in the early stages, or what is known as grip 3 in rail: fire safety and earthing and bonding, because of the complexities with the high voltage lines and EMC. But absolutely, when you're developing a scheme, whether it be a tower block, fire safety drives the civils. If you're doing fire safety on a brand new build, say it's a new Westfield, the fire engineer is going to model the volume and capacity of that building that's been developed by the architect and validate whether or not they can evacuate people safely. That may end up, and I've been on jobs where we've had to change the openings of buildings to make them from 4 meters to 6 meters, so that you can evacuate platforms or areas in 6 minutes or 4 minutes, depending on which
yeah.
piece of legislation you pull from. So if you do not get fire safety right at the start of the job, you will pay for it tenfold at the end of the job. And I have seen lots of projects in my career where they haven't done it and it's cost a bomb. So yeah, there's lots of legislation to be considered.
Right, we've been going on quite a lot, and to be honest, Paul, I could talk to you for hours, mate, about this sort of stuff
We could
because
do the world's first ever 24-hour podcast on one topic.
literally I can talk about fire safety. When I meet people, they're always like, "What's your passion?" I say electrical and fire safety, and it's something I can just keep going on and on about. So anyway, thank you for everybody for listening. As ever, if you've got any questions about any of this stuff or want us to talk about more topics within fire safety, by all means let us know, and we can have a podcast. We can get people in, which we know people between us, don't we, Paul?
We do. Many people.
How do you end a podcast?
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Bye bye.